Hold on to your butt.
Da-da-da. You were saying?
Welcome to episode 147 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As always, I am joined by my co-host Darren, the most awesome Civil War nerd I know. I am just Mary, and he asked me to do this intro again. And as always, I am not delivering any results.
Wow, that was fantastic. I was wondering why you're up all night preparing this intro. That was a good job. That was absolutely what I've never heard before. So how are you today, Mary? How's it going on today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. It's great. It's a cloudy Friday, but you know what? It's the weekend, and it's, the good things are afoot, I think.
Yeah. Well, I do not want to go consult ChatGPT for what it should think I should do for an intro for this episode.
That's probably a good idea.
Well, I mean, we'll get into it, but it's a kind of it's a heavier topic, you know.
Oh, sure.
For us,
sure.
A controversial one, obviously something that not a lot of, I think, people touch on in the Civil War, just because to this day it remains very, very controversial. But before we get into that, what are you drinking?
I actually thought you were going to forget. I really did. I am drinking. It is called, it's called Hoppy Trails IPA from around the corner at the Appalachian Brewing Company, which is our neighbor over here, and always some good libations. And I'm drinking it from my National Civil War Museum mug, which is another great place to go and visit our friends over there.
Yep.
So I'm going to reciprocate here, Mary, and say, what are you drinking?
I am drinking Down East cider, their pumpkin cider, which I'm suspecting was released back in like October. So you brought this home from Massachusetts. So
But you got to drink it.
I'm going to drink it.
Drink it.
It's very, very sweet. But anyway, so we are back after a couple weeks off. The last time y'all heard from us, we were recording live at Gettysburg here in Gettysburg. And we talked about the Battle of Bentonville and our experience that we had there when we did the reenactment back in March. Again, huge thanks to Carrie and Jan over at Gettysburg.
Don't forget Kat.
And Kat as well, for putting on an awesome event for Reenactor Weekend. But we are back here today for episode 147, and we are going to be talking about the Battle of Fort Pillow.
Yeah, we're going to talk about what's the third rail of Civil War battles, and the one that was fought on April 12th, 1864 in Lauderdale County, Tennessee on the Mississippi River. And this battle is it's one that's always polarizing, and the mere mention of Fort Pillow will likely turn the comments in your Facebook post into a simmering dumpster fire, usually, Mary.
Well, that's any Facebook post
Just
anymore.
True. But, the question, is this battle the war's greatest war crime, or is it one that's misunderstood and exaggerated to demonize its commanding general? And, wherever you fall, it's probably the war's ultimate he said, she said type battle that is still hotly debated today. And to get to that point, though, it's important to talk about what was happening in the area at the time, right? So Vicksburg had fallen to U.S. Grant the previous July, and the Confederate Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana, anyway, they made it their focus by its cavalry and their commanders to disrupt and annoy and gather supplies from Grant's army in the area. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, that'd be Abraham Lincoln, Mary, that was in effect, and black soldiers were now part of Lincoln's army, which again caused significant political fallout on both sides. Confederate Secretary of War and ultimate fun lover James Seddon made his government's policy clear in 1862 regarding the Federals' use of black soldiers, many of which were former slaves. And this is what he wrote about it. The question as to the slaves taken in federal uniform and with arms in their hands has been considered in conference with President Jefferson Davis. Slaves in a flagrant rebellion are subject to death by the laws of every slaveholding state. They cannot be recognized in any way as soldiers subject to the rules of war and to trial by military courts. Yet, for example, and to repress any spirit of insubordination, it is deemed essential that slaves in armed insurrection should meet punishment. Summary executions must therefore be inflicted on those taken, and with the slaves referred to by General Hugh Mercer, under circumstances indicative beyond doubt of actual rebellion. So again, what is he saying? If you're a black soldier fighting for the Union, there will be no quarter, something black soldiers knew very well, but you know what? They chose to fight anyway, right? one of the cavalry commands operating within this area in Leonidas Polk's Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana was led by the hard-fighting Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Yes, and we're going to talk a little bit about Forrest right now, just to give you some background on him. We'll probably end up doing a full episode about him at some point because he is a very definitely controversial figure in the Civil War, as well as interesting figure to study in the Civil War. So he's known as Old Bed and the Wizard of the Saddle, more commonly probably the Wizard of the Saddle. But he's born on July 13th, 1821 in Chapel Hill, Tennessee, to Miriam and William Forrest. And they are a poor settler family who live in a secluded cabin. Forrest does have a twin sister named Fanny. She unfortunately passes away in 1841 at the age of 20. She likely died from typhoid fever, which killed four of his other siblings as well around the same time. Forrest also had it, but he obviously recovered from it. It was until 1834 that his father continued blacksmithing, and then his family moves to Salem, Mississippi. Forrest's dad unfortunately dies in 1837, and when Forrest is around 16, he becomes head of his family, and he goes into his partnership with his uncle Jonathan Forrest in Hernando Valley, Mississippi in 1841. His uncle ends up getting killed in an argument by the Matlock brothers, which I remember watching that show with my aunt. Matlock, remember that show?
I don't think it's the same show.
No, but I'm talking about the show Matlock.
The hell?
You know? Anyway, with Andy Griffith. And you have no idea what I'm talking about, do you?
I unfortunately, I do.
Okay, anyway, in retaliation, Forrest shoots two of them and wounds two others, and one of whom is going to serve under him during the Civil War. Also in 1845, Forrest marries Mary Ann Montgomery, and they have two children. William Montgomery Bedford Forrest III, and he will serve with his father in the Civil War, and Fanny, obviously named after Forrest's twin sister, and she unfortunately passes away in 1854. She's around 5 years old. So Forrest's early business ventures included a livery stable, a stagecoach line, and a brickyard. He will become well known as a Memphis speculator and a Mississippi gambler. But from 1851 until 1860, and this is what Forrest is likely most well known for outside of the Civil War, is he is a slave trader. He is considered what's called one of the Big Four, and he makes thousands and thousands of dollars doing this. In 1858, he is elected as a Memphis City alderman as a Southern Democrat, and he will serve 2 consecutive terms. He owns 2 large cotton plantations in Coahoma County, Mississippi, and he bought half a property in Arkansas Plantation in 1859. By October of 1860, Nathan Bedford Forrest owns 3,345 acres of land in Mississippi. And by the start of the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest had become one of the wealthiest men in the southern U.S. He claimed his fortune at that time to be at least $1.5 million. And this is from slavery. This is from his plantations where he has slaves. This is from the slave trade as well. This is how he's making his money. Nathan Bedford Forrest stood around 6'2". He weighs around 180 pounds. He rarely drank and didn't use tobacco, which really surprised me. He's a skilled swordsman, and his demeanor, well, he tended to be pretty calm according to his men, but he could also drastically change his mood when provoked or angry. Well, he's not formally educated. He could read and write very well. So he's very articulate, but his spelling, if you read his letters, his spelling is apparently not that great. He's a Freemason, but only had the first degree.
I don't know what they are.
When the Civil War broke out, Forrest returned to Tennessee and enlisted in the CSA on June 14th, 1861. And he reports for training at Fort Wright near Randolph, Tennessee. He joins Captain Josiah Wright's cavalry company, the Tennessee Mounted Rifles, also the 7th Tennessee Cavalry, as a private. And this is when his 15-year-old son is going to join him. Now, Forrest, because he has so much money, he offers to buy horses and equipment with his own money for a regiment of Tennessee volunteer soldiers. And Governor of Tennessee Isham G. Harris, as well as some of Forrest's commanding officers, are very surprised that a man like Forrest, he's a significant planter, would enlist in the army, would voluntarily do this, because men like Forrest, these significant planters who made certain amounts of money, they are exempted from service in this. That's why you'll see that in certain movies of the Civil War, like these planters are they're not obviously fighting in the Civil War, right? They're They're on their plantations. He eventually would be commissioned as a lieutenant colonel and authorized to recruit and train a battalion of Confederate mounted rangers. In October of 1861, he is given command of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. But it should also be noted that Forrest has no formal military training, just as he had no formal education. But he exhibits what is considered to be good leadership, and he soon proved he could be successful militarily as well. But he has a reputation for maintaining discipline through force. I read a story where he hit a guy with an oar who didn't want to paddle across the Tennessee River. He is said to treat prisoners brutally, and this is stuff that is going to factor in to his reputation, especially after Fort Pillow. And his reputation at this time in the early Civil War meant that not many soldiers or junior officers want to serve under him. He posted recruitment posters that with the to join his regiment with the slogan, "Let's have some fun and kill some Yankees." He sounds like a real fun guy.
Well, you see those around Fenway Park, too, but it's a different story. You know? But, I mean, the thing about Forrest, though, is, I mean, for a guy with no education besides tracking and hunting and surviving,
Yep.
you know, he was pretty, you know, like you said before, he could read and write pretty well for a guy who grew up in the country.
Well, he's apparently very articulate. And there's a letter that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. That he apparently wrote to Bragg, but I've been told by a couple people that it never happened, but unless you can 100% prove it to me.
You know, what's fascinating about him, though, is that, you know, like you said before, he had a lot of money. When the war breaks out, he's going to enlist as a private in that Tennessee Mounted Rifles, kind of like J. Johnson Pettigrew. And he realized that he could speak a bunch of languages, and he moved on pretty quickly. But, you know, he did raise his own battalion, and it really didn't take long for Forrest to earn that reputation, you know, on the battlefield.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's going to distinguish himself at Fort Donelson, but before that, he's going to command, his first command of troops in the field is at the Battle of Sacramento, Kentucky, where he absolutely routs the U.S. Army. And then he's going to distinguish himself at Fort Donelson. And then after Fort Donelson, Forrest takes command of, it's Memphis, right? Memphis, Tennessee. And he sends a lot of those supplies to Atlanta. Now, I know you wanted to talk a bit about his time at Shiloh.
Well, even before that, I mean, if even go back before that, at Fort Donelson in February of 62, you know, Forrest is going to find himself cornered by U.S. Grant's men who, you know, he refuses to surrender. He's going to somehow escape with his 700 men to Nashville. And then, you know, a month or two later at Shiloh in April, you know, Forrest again finds himself surrounded. He gets shot in the back. But he escapes by famously grabbing a Union soldier and throwing him on his horse as a shield and riding off or dumping him. Again, you know, according to writer Shelby Foote, right, a man who considered Forrest one of the two geniuses in the Civil War, along
Him
with
and Abraham Lincoln.
Grant.
Oh,
Okay.
Grant. I thought it was Lincoln.
No, but the shot fired at Forrest as he galloped away is allegedly the last shot fired at the Battle of Shiloh. But again, Forrest's guerrilla tactics, again, they caused nightmares for Grant and especially William T. Sherman.
Oh, Sherman couldn't, we saw that in our episode we did about the Battle of Okolona, where Shaggy, a.k.a. William Sawyer Smith, is tasked with the cavalry, and he gets his ass beat by Forrest.
Right. But again, you know, because of Forrest's tactics, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, it forces Grant to change his Vicksburg strategy a little bit. But despite this, you know, anything Forrest, again, everything he wants to do, and everyone's got a boss, right? Anything he wants to do has to be approved by Leonidas Polk. And for the most part, his job was to disrupt Union supplies, especially along the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, right? Also, his job was to recruit as many troopers behind Union lines in West Tennessee as possible, which also meant to acquire supplies on their own. Now, again, Forrest was very successful at recruiting, and before long, he commanded 2 cavalry divisions, one led by James Chalmers and one by Abraham Buford, whose cousin John would be played by Sam Elliott in a movie a couple of 100 years
Apparently
later.
set in the town of Gettysburg.
Absolutely. I think it might have been the movie. But he's going to command 1,500 men. You know, Forrest now with his 2 divisions, they're going to launch an attack from the town of Lorman, Mississippi on Union supply lines, and they're going to try to cause as much mayhem and gather as many supplies as possible, which, again, they desperately needed. Now, by 1864, Richmond was struggling to get supplies, especially horses and especially mules. Forrest's men were no exception. Only 24% of Forrest's 2 divisions were combat effective. That's less than 1 in 5, Mary, if you're math majors like yourself. Many had no saddles. They were supposed to have 100 rounds of ammo. Most carried less than 20. Also, only 30% of his men had revolvers. And again, this lack of supplies led Forrest to participate in the Battle of Paducah on March 25th of 1864 in McCracken County, Kentucky, along the Ohio River. And it's interesting because before he attacks, and we're going to see this again soon, Forrest sent a message to Union Commander Stephen Hicks. And in it, it said, if I have to storm your works, you may expect no quarter. Okay? Hicks rejected the surrender demands, and soon they got routed, losing 400 horses to Forrest, enough to what? Create a future division of cavalry.
Yeah.
So they had to basically, to survive, they had to, they had to eat and do hunting.
I mean, Forrest, I think, too, he's obviously bluffing as well. But one of the things I do want to say is, like, Forrest, one of the reasons he finds himself here is because he had a falling out with his commander in 1863, Braxton Bragg, and basically was like, I am getting out of here. And I believe his commander became Leonidas Polk. Right. This is where that controversial letter comes into play that after Chickamauga, Bragg, basically runs his mouth about Forrest and says he's nothing more than a good raider. And this is a point when Forrest apparently loses his mind and said, you might as well not give me any more orders, for I will not obey them. And he also allegedly said, you have played the part of a damned scoundrel and you are a coward. And if you were any part of a man, I would slap your jaws and force you to resent it. He ended it by saying, if you ever try to interfere with me or cross my path, it will be at the peril of your life. This is an alleged letter he wrote. It's not 100% known if it's true, but it is in the it's part of the memory, I guess you call it the historical memory that we have about Nathan Bedford Forrest. And honestly, what I've read about him, I could see him saying these words, especially if someone's going to call him a damned raider or just a good raider. But that's how he gets here with the rank of Major General, which he's given on December 4th, 1863.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Forrest, though, is you mentioned before, for someone who, he spent a lot of time reading newspapers.
Yeah.
To hear about his exploits. He loves getting his name in the paper, right? That's what it was. After Paducah, he read a report that said despite Forrest's success, he missed several horses that were hidden. In reading this, you know what he does? He orders Abraham Buford back to Paducah, where he happily captured the ones that he missed. So no wonder everybody hates the damn media, right? That's what happens. Another reason why Forrest read the papers is he enjoyed really being angered by what was written about him up north. He was insulted. He was chided. He was ridiculed regularly by the northern newspapers. And it did piss him off, and it pissed off his men greatly. But it, again, provided that additional motivation to fight even harder. During that horse gathering raid in Paducah, a colonel in Forrest Cavalry, Colonel A.P. Thompson, was killed by an artillery shell fired from a Union gunboat just west of the town at a place called Fort Anderson, okay? Though knowing Colonel Thompson was killed by a shell, the Louisville Journal mocked it as a failed raid and said that Thompson was killed not by a shell, that he was shot in the head by a black soldier. Now, this article also accused Forrest men of being nothing more than a drunken mob and accused them of pillaging the town of Paducah, raiding citizens' homes. And again, you just picture Forrest, he's sitting back reading these accounts, predictably angry and angered by the thought that they were being labeled as bloodthirsty mercenaries out to kill blacks and would run when attacked by federal troops. So again, this is the mindset in the north of this guy. By April of 64, and with Paducah now in the rearview mirror, Forrest is going to target another Union fort about 130 miles southwest along the Mississippi River called Fort Pillow. And this is primarily the primary talk here. Forrest wrote to General Polk, "There is a federal force of 500 at Fort Pillow, which I shall attend to in a day or two, as they have horses and supplies we need." Now, Fort Pillow was named for Rebel General Gideon Pillow. It was built to protect the city of Memphis, but it fell to Union troops in the summer of 62. It was commanded by a Major Lionel F. Booth, which is funny because it was an alias.
Yeah.
His real name was George Lanning. And you know why he hid under his alias? So his family couldn't find him.
Oh my God. Was he perhaps naming himself after the Booth family, like the actors?
Who knows? But I think we can all relate from hiding from family. But this dude had his own alias to hide from them. But again, Booth had only been commanding the fort for about 2 weeks, taking command on the 28th of March, 1864. He will relieve his former commander, a guy named Major William Bradford. Bradford remained at the fort and commanded a battalion of Union cavalry from West Tennessee. Now, also under Booth's command at Fort Pillow was Battery D of the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery, as well as 4 companies of the 6th U.S. Colored Artillery. So in total, Booth at Fort Pillow has 557 men, including 282 black troops, many of which were former enslaved men who knew the Confederates' policy, again, towards black soldiers, what that meant, and what would happen if they were captured. And so you can just imagine, right? Now, Booth, for whatever reason, felt Fort Pillow was safe, right? Safe is a cool side of the pillow, right? But being about 60 miles from Union-held Memphis and protected by federal gunboats in the Mississippi River. April 3rd, 1864, Booth is going to write to his commander, General Stephen Hurlbut, the commander of the 16th Corps, who's sitting down in Memphis, who would be famously resigned in 1865 when he got caught for embezzlement from the U.S. Army, by the way.
Shocker.
But this is what the letter wrote. Everything is quiet within a radius of 40 miles. I do not think any apprehension need be felt or fears entertained in reference to this place being attacked or even threatened.
Famous last words,
Exactly.
as always in the Civil War.
I think it'd be perfectly safe. I can hold this post against any force for 48 hours. Despite thinking everything is awesome, right? The fort was very vulnerable to a land attack.
Yeah, and that's because of its design, because it's the way it's designed is that so it's located on a high bluff and it's protected by 3 lines of entrenchments around a semicircle. And there was a protective parapet 4 feet thick and between 6 and 8 feet high, which surrounded by a ditch. The design of the fort made it so that defenders would be at a disadvantage since the approaching troops could not be found out without mounting the top of the fired upon without mounting the top of the parapet, which meant that the defenders, would also be subjected to enemy fire. There was also 6 artillery pieces, but because of the width of the parapet, the operators of the artillery pieces found it difficult to depress their barrels enough to fire on the attackers once they got close enough. There is also the USS New Era, which was a gunboat. It was also available for defense, and it was commanded by Captain James Marshall. So that's why it's not like Fort Pillow. It's like he thinks he's safe where he is, but if he's got to do a battle, like the fort is not designed. If you're defending, it's really, really difficult because of how it's built.
Exactly. I mean, New Era, it's got 6 24-pound howitzers. It's 137 feet. It's not a ironclad. It's a wooden boat. But again, you're thinking, okay, it's pretty safe, ideally. And here's the thing, though, and this is where again, when you're talking Fort Pillow, you're talking about different things, okay? And, we mentioned earlier the letter that Forrest wrote, to Polk about getting supplies. And they were always needing supplies, but he did an interview. This is Forrest now, with a writer named Jim Bonick from the Cincinnati Daily Commercial newspaper on September 3rd, 1868. And he gave further insight into another reason why they targeted Fort Pillow. And this is not very discussed all that often. According to Forrest, Major William Bradford's Union troops from Tennessee had spent some time 60 miles to the east of Fort Pillow at the town of Jackson, Tennessee. Now, Jackson, Tennessee was the site of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad where Bradford's men were guarding. This was a vital supply line for Grant's first plan to attack Vicksburg. They had to guard the supply. They had to guard the train. Now, while in town, Forrest claimed Bradford's men pillaged the town while pretending to look for rebel weapons. Forrest said they arrested civilians, harassed women and older men, Many of these people in town were direct relatives of Forrest's men from Jackson in his command. For that reason, knowing Bradford and his Tennessee Unionists were at Fort Pillow, they told Forrest that they would refuse to leave Tennessee unless they attacked Fort Pillow in retribution for what they did to their families in Jackson. These people were mad.
Yeah.
Also in April, Jackson was the location of Forrest's headquarters at the time, so the citizens of the town begged him to attack Fort Pillow, attack Bradford and those West Tennessee men to avenge what they considered was a lawless occupation. So Forrest, he capitulates to this men and he agrees to attack Fort Pillow. But he said, despite his success, he basically said, it's not worth losing men for. But if you guys, we need some supplies, that's true.
Yeah.
But if you're this mad and you want to do a fun run,
yeah,
we can go take revenge. Sidebar, the Rebs eventually took Jackson, Tennessee. In that railroad, it forced Grant to change his original plan, which led to the siege of Vicksburg later that spring into summertime. So when the rebels took that, it kind of put a cramp in the junk of U.S. Grant, right? Forrest men made their way to Fort Pillow and quickly discovered those weak points you were talking about, right? That Booth had apparently ignored. The ravines in front offered cover for an invading force, and in some places they were just 20 yards from the fort. They were that without being seen. Also, the placement of Union artillery was completely useless to a land attack. Those Civil War cannons, they use that long parabolic curve, right? And they're very ineffective when troops get close because they would just merely fire over their heads. Yeah. They weren't siege guns. They couldn't push the guns down into the ravine. Also, like you said before, there are plenty of trees to hide behind. And overall, this fort was impossible to defend, especially against cavalry.
Yeah, and that's how it sounds. Like I was reading about the description of the fort and I was like, oh my gosh, this is not, just sort of no Booth is like saying, yeah, we're fine. It's like, do you know how to defend this place? Because if you get attacked, you're basically screwed, right?
That was the exact quote he said. But again, Forrest realized, okay, I can take this fort pretty easily. I got a 3-to-1 manpower advantage, as well as a fort is vulnerable to attack via land. So we can make quick work of this. On April 12th, 3 years to the day of the firing of Fort Sumter, James Chalmers' division, again, one of two divisions under Buford, with Buford under Forrest, they're going to open fire on the Federal pickets on that third outer trench at about 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, the Feds on the third and outer trench, what do you think they did?
They, Get out of there.
They turned and ran like hell and ran back to the middle trenches. And in response, Captain Marshall on that USS New Era, he's going to open up his guns. He will fire 282 shells at Forrest men, doing virtually no damage whatsoever. Eventually, they're going to back off after rebel sharpshooters took aim of it. He had to cool his guns, and he had to literally. Forrest himself is going to make the 26-mile ride from Jackson to Fort Pillow. He'll get there around 9 o'clock in the morning or so. And at this point, the Rebs were actually initially repulsed by the Federals in the fort, but during the first assault, guess what happens?
Major Booth is going to be killed.
He doesn't make it.
No.
He gets shot trying to cheer his men on. Now, taking over the fort. Now, again, in the top of the first inning, your best pitcher, your lead is gone. Yeah. So taking over again is Major William Bradford. Again, Bradford was in control of the fort, before Booth got there.
And he leads the 13th West Tennessee Cavalry. And the one thing he's going to do is whenever he has to write to Forrest, he's not going to say that he's Bradford. He's going to say he's Booth.
Right. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but that's exactly what happens. He's the commander of the 13th West Tennessee Cavalry. He's also the one who allegedly had raided Jackson. Okay. So that's exactly what the problem is. Describing Forrest's first assault was a guy named Lieutenant Mac Leeming. And we'll talk a lot about him because he has a lot of quotes about this. He's of the 13th West Tennessee Cavalry. Leeming's going to write, our garrison immediately opened fire and continued without cessation, principal from behind logs, stumps, and under cover of thick underbrush, until the Rebs made a general assault on our works, which was successfully repelled with severe losses to them. And again, things fell apart pretty quickly for Bradford.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because Bradford didn't have sharpshooters.
No.
Forrest did. The rebel sharpshooters were hiding behind these hidden ravines close to the fort, were picking off troops one by one, and also preventing any escape via land from the Union troops.
And they also prevented the new era from being able to participate in the battle because the men were being shot. So they basically had to shut the guns down, and they couldn't. The boat was not able to be used, and that was its whole purpose, was to help defend if there was an attack.
So Lieutenant Mac Leeming, he's going to describe the scene again. We suffered severely from the loss of commissioned officers by the unerring aim of rebel sharpshooters. So now Forrest is on the field, and he's going to notice that the second rebel assault was getting also bogged down, and this battle was kind of turning into a stalemate. And to prevent the rebel sharpshooters from using the barracks to hide behind, Bradford ordered them burned, which was also confirmed in a report by the 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Van Horn of the 6th USCT Heavy Artillery. One of the misconceptions of Fort Pillow was that the Confederates burned the barracks. Mm-hmm. And it's documented that it was actually Bradford did it, because he did so because he did not want, kind of like the Bliss Farm getting burned over here.
Yeah, they didn't want them getting it.
And they did. So at this point, Forrest is going to go back to that Paducah game plan. And he's going to pull out his pen and he's going to write a message under a flag of truce demanding the surrender of Fort Pillow to avoid further bloodshed. Now, again, you mentioned before, not knowing Major Booth was killed, it was now under the command of Bradford.
Yeah.
And what does Forrest write?
He writes, "The conduct of the officers and men garrisoning Fort Pillow had been such as to entitle them to being treated as prisoners of war. I demand the unconditional surrender of the entire garrison, promising that you shall be treated as prisoners of war. My men have just received a fresh supply of ammunition, and from their present position can easily assault and capture the fort. Should my demand be refused, I cannot be responsible for the fate of your command."
Right. So basically, if they refused, Forrest was saying that, hey, listen, I cannot be responsible for what happens. I've got a couple of divisions here who are pissed off that a lot of their family was screwed with in Jackson. So if I send these people in, they're going to be barbarians, okay? So they don't know that. But what Bradford didn't know, again, was this. He doesn't know this lust for revenge, this bloodlust that a lot of Forrest guys had.
Yeah.
Forrest, in that interview I mentioned with that Cincinnati Daily, Jim Bonick in 1868, this is what Forrest says. "The animosity existing between the Tennessee troops in my command and the Tennessee troops in Fort Pillow was such that I could not be responsible for the fate of the garrison." Now, again, the million-dollar question is whether or not Forrest knew there were black troops inside the fort.
Yep.
And if the promise of being treated, like you read the thing, if that promise of being treated as prisoners of war would apply to them. But according to Captain W.A. Goodwin, who was on Forrest's staff, he says Forrest knew there were blacks in there, and he wrote after the war. Again, this is after the war, so take a grain of salt here. There was a discussion among the officers present, and it was asked whether it was intended to include the Negro soldiers as well as the whites, to which both Generals Forrest and General Chalmers replied that it was so intended, and if the fort surrendered, the whole garrison, white and black, would be treated as prisoners of war. Now, again, the key word here is if.
Yeah.
Everything hinges on the phrase, if the fort surrendered,
Yeah.
right? Lieutenant Mac Leeming is the one who met with the rebels under that flag of truce to receive Forrest's message, and he was about 150 yards outside the fort's walls. Bradford told Leeming to request 1 hour to make sure and make up the minds whether or not to give a Fort Pillow and surrender the garrison, so they can discuss the options with the officers on the gunboat New Era. But here's the problem, Mary. There's always a problem.
Yeah.
Not long after Leeming returns that message, he received another one from Forrest saying, "Come here ASAFP."
Yeah.
And Forrest was mad, right?
Yeah.
He was pissed because almost immediately after getting the "give us an hour" message, Forrest started to get reports from his men that they saw smoke on the river coming from the Union gunboats, the Liberty and the Olive Branch, and realized that the hour was nothing more than a ruse to buy time for Union enforcements.
Yeah.
Forrest also learned that the Federals had landed a force down the river at the town of Fulton, about 5 miles southwest of Fort Pillow, which would be able to cross overland into Forrest's Savannah and cut off his retreat. So when Leeming met with Forrest, he got an ultimatum.
Yeah. He basically says, Forrest is like, I'm only giving you 20 minutes. He said, I shall assault the fort. And Bradford is like, I will not surrender.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Is he gets 20 minutes, and Forrest said he was in no mood for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And when Bradford gave the ultimate message in the official response, it was literally,
I will not surrender.
I will not surrender. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, L.E. Booth, commanding forces Fort Pillow XOXO. But again, like you said before, Bradford had forged his name because you don't want to tell your opponent that the big man's
the
down.
dude's dead. Yeah.
Right? But again, this was all Forrest needed to unleash hell in his frenzied troops on Fort Pillow. Again, they were ready to go.
Yeah. And I too think this goes back to when we were talking about Forrest's background, the one thing about him was that, he had a tendency to be pretty calm and collected, but it took one little thing and he would like fly off the handle. And I think this is a case where he's clearly like, he's angry. He's like, okay, fine. Like, you're not going to surrender. Then he orders his bugler to sound the charge. And of course, his men are already fired up. They're going to see him fired up, and that's going to fire them up even more.
Right. Bradford's decision, again, and this is where you get into the gray area with this, okay? Bradford's decision not to surrender, really, not only did it prove to be a fatal error, but in his defense, based on James Seddon's edict, he was likely convinced that surrendering his black troops meant instant death or a return to slavery for all of them. He could not have known that Forrest had agreed to treat them as POWs, assuming this is correct, right?
Yeah.
So fighting gave them their only chance. If fight or flight, you have no choice in this situation if that's what you believe. Bradford continued to order the barracks burned to allow smoke to obscure the rebel view. Lieutenant McLeamy again. From these barracks, the enemy kept up a murderous fire on our men despite our best efforts to dislodge them. Bradford and his men had no chance once Forrest attacked.
Yeah.
I mean, it was such a joke. Forrest wrote after the battle, as our troops mounted and poured into the fortification, the enemy retreated towards the river, arms in hands and firing back as they ran. The Union troops ran like hell, jumping into the Mississippi, trying to swim to that Union gunboat New Era. The whole battle, the whole assault on Fort Pillow lasted about 20 minutes, okay? As soon as Forrest saw the U.S. flag taken down from a 60-foot flagpole, he knew the game was over. But again, this is where, sadly, the story does not end there.
No, it doesn't.
And this is really what happened next is why the Battle of Fort Pillow will be forever counted among the darkest moments in the Civil War.
It basically becomes a massacre. It's also known as the Massacre of Fort Pillow.
Right. But again, remember the context, though, okay? Because we're going to tell these stories.
Yeah.
But again, you have an angry and revenge-crazed Confederate cavalry against black troops that felt if they surrendered, it meant certain death, okay? To the men of the USCT, throwing down their arms meant death. So they felt their only chance of surviving was to fight until the very end. Now, assuming Forrest pledged that they be taken as POWs was true, and there's no reason to think otherwise, despite what's said and ordered, okay, there was no way possible that these USCT guys could have known that. After Fort Pillow fell and the Rebs began to gather prisoners, they were still being fired on by the Federal soldiers. Many of them were the black troops. When the Rebs discovered that they were being fired upon anyways after the flag of truce had been done, and they considered the battle was over, everything went sideways. So you have angry Rebs are going to start to chase down the retreating blacks, many of whom were stopping to fire back as they fled. And soon they focus on chasing the black troops down and killing them. Again, the rebel officers immediately lost control of the situation here. They absolutely did, right? In his diary, a Confederate named DeWitt Clinton Ford, the commander of the Ford Scouts under Forrest, he wrote, "The wildest confusion prevailed among those who ran down the bluff. Many of them had thrown down their arms while running and seemed desirous to surrender, while many others had carried their guns with them and were loading and firing up the bluff at us with a desperation which seemed worse than senseless."
I found an account from Confederate Achilles B. Clark to his sister. "Our men were so exasperated by the Yankees' threats of no quarter that they gave but little. The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy, but they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. The white men fared a little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Human blood stood about in pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had particularly succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of blood, and the firing ceased."
I mean, it gets worse. Lieutenant Mac Leaming, he wrote after the war what he saw when the rebels stormed the fort. Quote, "We had barely time to fire one volley before they swarmed over our works. Our line broke, and many of the troops threw down their muskets and rushed down the bluff towards the river. The rebels, meanwhile, kept up a murderous fire. Many of the colored soldiers, seeking no quarter was to be given, jumped into the river while the rebels stood on the banks and shot at the heads of the victims in the muddy water." So again, Leaming is then described seeing two rebels pulling a black surrendering soldier from the water, and one Reb putting a revolver to his head and firing.
Ugh.
Leaming himself was shot and wounded before being captured and taken to a rebel field hospital, where he said he received a bottle of brandy personally from General Chalmers. Okay, there you go.
Wow.
But again, while in these hospital barracks, the ones that weren't burned, Leaming told of hearing occasional gunfire, but then hearing an order of ceasefire by a rebel officer who then arrested a Confederate for disobeying and firing anyways. During the night of the 12th, after the battle, Leaming says the injured, both black and white, were collected and placed in the remaining row of barracks outside the fort's perimeter, that hadn't been burned yet. Throughout the night, he said he heard a sporadic musket fire from time to time. The next morning, on April 13th, a Union gunboat arrived from Memphis, which began to shell the rebels along the riverbank. Forrest, in response, is going to fire back before ordering the remaining barracks all remaining fort buildings burned to obscure the gunboats from seeing the targets. So now Forrest is going to burn these barracks, right? Because he needs to protect his men. The problem here, some of the barracks that caught fire were the ones housing the Union wounded, including Leaming. Leaming realized the impending nightmare as many of the men could not move as the barracks caught fire, which spread from the ones that Forrest had ordered burned. Now, Forrest didn't order the hospital ones burned, but the fire spread. He the other ones. Rebel officers and soldiers ran in and began to remove the Union wounded before the fire took them, but they couldn't get all of them. Soon the barracks were completely engulfed in flames, while Leaming and the others, both black and white, were dragged and placed out of harm's way. Now, afterwards, in the Committee of the Conduct of War, they reported testimony that some of the Union wounded were burned alive in the fire. And they wrote, quote, "The charred remains of 5 or 6 bodies were afterward found. All but one was so disfigured that after being consumed by the flames that they could not be identified."
Wow.
But wait, there's more, right? Leaming's story gets even darker with this. According to Leaming, he was lying on the ground along with 2 black wounded soldiers that they dragged them out afterwards when a rebel walked by, aimed his gun at one of the blacks, and killed him as he begged for his life.
Oh, my God.
He said the same rebel then turned to the other black man. The black man cried, "Please, sir, the Yankees made me fight." He killed him anyway.
Oh.
Leaming was convinced that the occasional gunfire he'd been hearing overnight was likely these random executions of black troops, like the ones he just witnessed. And he didn't know that, but that's what he surmised. As the morning grew later, Forrest will send a flag of truce to the USS New Era, saying that if they recognize his authority of parole, he would permit a landing party to come ashore and recover the rest of the wounded men and bury their dead. Among the landing party was an embedded reporter from the New York Times who corroborated what Leeming had reported, as well as hearing the story of a U.S. Navy officer named Robert Critchell, who was a second mate on the USS Silver Cloud. Now, Mitch Critchell was friends with a congressman named Henry T. Blow from Missouri, and he detailed accounts of colored troops summarily executed by Confederate soldiers. Not only, but Critchell was pissed and demanded retaliation by the feds at this. According to Critchell, he saw 70 dead USCT bodies lying on the riverbank, many with 2 gunshots, one from the original wound and the second which was done during their execution. Critchell also reported countless black soldiers who had been bayoneted through the eyes, these mostly being troops of the 6th U.S. Colored Artillery, as well as charred bodies in the barracks. Now, you can imagine, we mentioned before how the newspapers considered Forrest.
Yep.
The newspapers in the North had a field day with this.
Oh, it was the whole thing, including what the Joint Committee for the Conduct of War is saying about it, with their investigation behind it. It is going to be widely publicized as to what has happened here. And Lincoln and his cabinet, they do meet to ask, this is in May now. Lincoln is asking his cabinet for how do they respond to this massacre. And they debate about it. They really don't know, what to do with it. Gideon Wells will write, Stanton fell in with my suggestion so far as to propose that should Forrest or Chalmers or any other officer conspicuous in this butchery be captured, he should be turned over for trial for the murders at Fort Pillow. I sat beside Chase and mentioned to him some of the advantages of this course, and he said that it made a favorable impression. I urged him to say so, for it appeared to me that the president and Seward did not appreciate it. And no action was ever taken because other things apparently came up and they didn't pursue it. Lincoln says to Frederick Douglass, if once begun, there was no telling where retaliation would end. And Lincoln also stated that only victory in the North would generally bring justice, as the perpetrators can only be effectually reached by a successful prosecution of the war. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the stance that Lincoln's cabinet took on it. Like, they were debating it, and it sounds like, they just couldn't, they wanted to, I think, put them to trial if they were caught, but then other stuff came up and they just never did. But it also sounds like Lincoln didn't really want to deal with that aspect of it either. No,
he had the Lieber Code he put in earlier, but that only applied to the Northern troops. But going back to Forrest, that interview in 1868 with that Cincinnati newspaper, Forrest is going to deny all responsibility in participating in Fort Pillow because it was a war criminal thing. He described what he saw. This is Forrest's words now. The Negroes ran out down to the river, and although the white flag was flying, they kept turning back and shooting at my men, who consequently continued to fire into them that were crowded on the brink of the river, and they killed as many of them despite my efforts with my officers to stop them. There was no deliberate intention nor effort to massacre the garrison, as has been so generally reported by the Northern newspapers. Forrest also said that after the fort fell, he ordered the killings to be stopped, and he said in one case he shot one of his own men personally who ignored the order. Forrest was also adamant that no one was ordered to kill anyone after the fort fell by himself nor General Chalmers. So again, this is what he's saying. Now, he may have felt the way in 1868, but the problem was he immediately after the battle, Forrest described the Battle of Fort Pillow to his boss, General Pope, this way. And this is what he wrote. This is right after the battle. The river was dyed with blood of the slaughtered for 200 yards. The loss was 500 killed, but few of the officers escaped. My loss was about 20 killed. It is hoped that these factors will demonstrate to the Northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners. Okay, again, so it leaves a lot of questions, right?
Yep.
Did Forrest order the murders, or did his troops lose control and ignore the orders of Chalmers and Forrest? Don't forget, too, you have the black troops who felt they could not surrender. You have the Confederates who were firing them because they were being fired upon.
Yeah.
And they were also incensed by what happened in Jackson, Tennessee.
Yeah.
So despite the fear of being killed or surrendering, I mean, is it unreasonable to think that the Confederates kept firing on them because they were being fired upon? Elon Farnsworth over here in Gettysburg, he was killed after he was running away and shot because he was still firing as he was trying to run away.
It happened, I think, in the West was it in Antietam too, right? When they were running as they were still firing as well.
Now there's no question that it was a massacre.
Yeah.
But the question that is fair to be asked was, there's really no evidence whatsoever that Forrest or Chalmers or Buford ordered it. There's none. The Northern newspapers ran with it, and they called him a war criminal. But again, that's the $1 million question. Another Union witness to this post-battle was William Ferguson. He was a commander of the USS Silver Cloud who wrote a letter to Commander Stephen Hurlbut. He wrote about Forrest's truce that allowed him to collect the wounded and dead, and noted that many Confederates assisted in loading the wounded troops onto the ship. But he also described that gruesome scene of bayoneted bodies, and it looked like they were killed by a ruthless Indian tribe, which he described as the unmistakable evidence of a massacre. Now, when news of this battle and massacre spread in the North, aided by these Northern newspapers fanning the flames of war crimes, by incorrectly reporting that women and children were among the slaughtered, they were not, but this is what was being reported. So again, it's he said, she said.
Yeah.
Remember, Fort Pillow was a battle cry in the North, and it led to a lot of changes in political, ramifications.
Yeah.
In the battle's aftermath, U.S. Grant orders General Benjamin Spoons Butler, Mary, to negotiate the prisoner exchange system by demanding black soldiers be treated equally as whites. And again, Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon, he refused this Grant's demand, and he wrote, "I doubt, however, whether the exchange of Negroes for our soldiers would be tolerated. We will never be inconvenienced with such prisoners."
So Grant said of it, subsequently, Forrest made a report in which he left out the part which shocks humanity to read. That is in Grant's memoirs. Sherman weighs in on it as well. Keep in mind, this is the guy that Sherman said, I don't care how much it costs if it bankrupts the Treasury. Forrest has to be stopped. Sherman said of it, the massacre at Fort Pillow occurred on April 12, 1864, and has been the subject of congressional inquiry. No doubt Forrest's men acted like a set of barbarians, shooting down the helpless Negro garrison after the fort was in their possession. But I am told that Forrest personally disclaims any active participation in the assault, and that he stopped the firing as soon as he could. I also take it for granted that Forrest did not lead the assault in person, and consequently that he was to the rear, out of sight, if not of hearing at the time, and I was told by hundreds of our men who were at various times prisoners in Forrest's possession that he was usually very kind to them. He had a desperate set of fellows under him, and at that very time there is no doubt the feeling of the Southern people was fearfully savage on this very point of our making soldiers out of their late slaves, and Forrest may have shared the feeling. And that was Sherman.
Again, it's he said, she said. Now, one story that's often not told about the Battle of Fort Pillow is the fate of the fort's commander, William Bradford. It's been mistakenly reported that he was killed during the battle, but when the fort fell, Bradford tried to surrender, but he was shot at. He jumped into the river and tried to swim away, but was captured and returned to the shore. But before he got to land, he was shot at again before finally being caught by a rebel named Matt Ward. Okay. Eventually, Bradford's identity was discovered as the commander of the fort, and he was returned to the fort unharmed, where he found not only the body of his commander, Booth, but also the dead body of his brother, Theodoric. Now, upon finding his brother's body, Bradford was approached by Forrest, who was angry. This is the first time they met. Mm-hmm. Forrest was mad at him for not surrendering the fort, and Bradford basically admitted, I didn't surrender the fort because I didn't trust that you would give the black troops a fair treatment. Mm-hmm. That's, again, we talked about that. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
When Forrest learned of Bradford's brother's death, his mood changed, though. He sympathized with him because don't forget, Forrest lost his brother Jeffrey.
Yeah, at Okolona, right?
About 2 months before Fort Pillow. So Forrest softened and ordered 2 men to help Bradford dig a grave for his brother. Now, again, the men who ordered to help did not like it, And they said basically Forrest told his men to shoot Bradford if he tried to escape. But Bradford was happy to be alive, but he still wanted to escape. And the opportunity came at his brother's funeral. His captor, Matt Ward, the guy who caught him, was at the funeral and found a jug of whiskey. And before long, a call me maybe situation ensued, Barry. And Matt Ward got drunk and passed out. Okay, must have been at the mine. So with Ward out cold, Bradford found a pair of pants in a sutler's tent, took off the rest of his uniform to look like a civilian, and was able to convince a Confederate trooper named Jack Jenkins at a picket line, hazardous too, that he was a sutler and he was allowed to slip away. Now Bradford, he got caught a couple hours later by a rebel patrol near Covington, Tennessee, and soon the patrol's commanding officer, named Colonel William Ducksworth, he recognized him as Bradford, the Fort Pillow commander, and he was arrested. The next day, Bradford was taken to Brownsville, Tennessee, with other Union prisoners to a camp that was guarded by some of Forrest's cavalry. Guess who was in the cavalry group, this group? Jack Jenkins, the man he tricked into thinking he was a sutler.
Oof.
Jenkins had got his ass reamed for letting him escape. Now Jenkins had him. Jenkins angrily reminded Bradford how much he'd been humiliated. And Jenkins let it be known that Bradford was going to be in danger as long as he was around Jenkins. Yeah. The next day, Bradford was set to be transferred to Jackson, Tennessee. And since it was a long ride, Jenkins asked Bradford, hey, do you need to use the bathroom? You got to pee before we go? It's going to be a long ride. So Bradford agreed. He got out of the wagon. He stood next to a tree to pee. While in the middle of peeing, Jenkins yelled, he's trying to escape, and he was shot to death while he was peeing.
Oh my God.
This ended the life of William Bradford, the commander of Fort Pillow. Again, it's a lot of stories about Fort Pillow, but this one doesn't usually get told.
Yeah.
That's a tough one, you know. So for Nathan Bedford Forrest, again, whether he ordered the massacre or not, Fort Pillow and the accusations of him being a racist war criminal, they followed him everywhere.
Yep.
He spent the rest of his life defending himself for this. Now, again, everyone has a story, a opinion about Forrest. I mean, he is as polarizing as a guy as you will find in American history.
Yeah.
Okay. He did have ties to the Klan, and everybody knows that.
Yep.
But the stories of Forrest being its founder are not correct.
No.
That's wrong. While the Klan did start in Pulaski, Tennessee, by 6 Confederate soldiers, none of them was named Forrest.
No.
Okay? He was brought into the Klan by his former chief of artillery, a guy named John Morton, and reportedly joined more so to deal with the state of politics in Tennessee versus race violence, which again seems to jibe with the fact that he left the Klan and ordered its abandonment.
Dissolved the Klan, ordered their costumes destroyed, but this obviously didn't happen.
When it became violent, and that's the thing. And it's interesting, if you look at Forrest the later years, and he didn't live long after the war.
No.
He really didn't.
And he's going to struggle financially after the war for obvious reasons. Look at what he was, he's a slave trader. He's a plantation owner. He is going to struggle. He's going to use convict labor to build railways after the war as well. And he's really his post-Civil War is obviously he's struggling financially and stuff too, but he gets involved with the railways too, building them.
Yeah. On July 5th, 1875 in Memphis, Forrest is going to give a speech to a group of black Southerners called the Pole Bearers, advocating improvement of economic conditions for blacks. Now, again, he definitely has some kind of racial softening by this point because he's a different guy.
Yeah.
And this is not to make excuses for
we are absolutely we are not defending or apologizing Forrest here.
But all we're saying is that his later years are different from his earlier years. Although he's been accused of not writing the speech because, again, his lack of education. But he's been
described as being very articulate,
right,
and a good writer, other than his spelling.
I mean, the problem with the Pole Bearer speech is the original copy is lost to history. No one knows where the hell it is. But there's transcripts, and this is the quote he has that Forrest said to a group of black Southerners in Memphis: I will say to you, in the colored race, that men who bore arms and followed the flag of the Confederacy are, with few examples, probably early, your friends. Many things have been said about me which are wrong, in which white and black persons here who stood by me through the war can contradict. Go to work, be industrious, and when you are oppressed, I will come to your relief and assure you that I am with you in heart and in hand. Okay, now what does this all mean? Who knows? Like all history, it's determined by the person who reads it and studies it.
Yeah.
So is this part of the lost cause narrative, or is simply a way to deflect responsibility from his actions during the war?
Yeah, is he trying to like kind of atone for what happened during the war? And like I said, that one letter I found that was written by Achilles Clark, Achilles Clark does say that Forrest said, shoot them like dogs. And that is during when they're running away. So there are stories out there on both sides. And I think the thing is Fort Pillow is, as you said very well at the beginning of this episode, it is the third rail. Not many people will touch it, and it's something though that I think needs to be studied, especially now. And it's one of those ones where you have to pick through. And if whatever your opinion is going into it, look at what is said and come to your own conclusions for what happened there. But, yes, it is a massacre. It is one of the darkest points in American history.
There's no question. In the end of the 557 troops present at Fort Pillow, 221 were killed, 130 wounded, and it's a rare example of that there were more killed than wounded, which speaks of the executions. Yeah. 45 black soldiers were captured and returned to the South to slavery, while 7 white officers and 215 captives were sent to Demopolis, Alabama to be paroled. So again, in the end, when you look at someone like this, and no one's trying to skew one side or the other with this. The whole point of talking about Fort Pillow is to talk about quotes on both sides and let the listener or the reader or the historian decide what's what. But in the end, Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Battle of Fort Pillow will always be a polarizing discussion forever. And it always will be why this will forever be the war's ultimate he said, she said story.
Yep.
Is Fort Pillow the war's greatest war crime, or a battle gone wrong that got out of control? And again, that is ultimately up to the eye of the beholder.
Yeah. And I think it says like, even when you're looking at Lincoln's cabinet with this and Lincoln trying to decide what to do in real time, not even a month after the battle on May 3rd, he and his cabinet can't even really come to a decision. It's clear what Gideon Welles wants to do, and that's try them. He wants to get Forrest. He wants to get Chalmers. But Lincoln is, who knows what he was thinking, like hesitant to do that, whether he sensed the war the war still had a year to go at that, or just under a year to go at that point. But, not even he doesn't even know how you deal with it. What if you capture Forrest? Do you try him for it? Like so not even the president knows how to deal with it.
No. And again, he didn't get a lot of supplies out of there. His men, unfortunately, got the revenge they wanted from Jackson. But again, when you look back at the war, there are certain flashpoints. There are certain type of forks in the road. And Fort Pillow is definitely one of them.
Yep.
It led to the change in the parole system. It led to ultimately things like Andersonville, Camp Douglas. I mean, it changed the prison system. The exchange program in a lot of ways was changed or completely wiped away. And again, when you look at the stories, you can read one aspect of it and get a totally different aspect if you read another side of the story. And that's why it's so polarizing. That's why people in the South think that Forrest was unfairly treated. People in the North think he's the worst thing since New Coke. Unfortunately, right? But again, it's all in the eye of the beholder. And the whole point of this, like I said, this episode is not to take a side. It's simply to tell both sides of the story and research it and figure out what you think and see what it is. But like so many other aspects of the Civil War, the devil's in the details, and there's way much more into the story of Fort Pillow that I think probably people think about. And I think it's because it makes you feel uncomfortable.
Oh, it is. It's absolutely one of the most uncomfortable battles in the Civil War, I think, to study. And it's, it is a massacre. It's not just the battle, it is a massacre. And I think that's why it has become such a polarizing battle, and one that people are, I don't want to say scared to touch, but it's one that it's like, not one that is widely studied. And when you do bring it up, strong emotions come about on either side because of what happened and because of who is involved.
And it's true. And at the end of the day, he wasn't charged as a war criminal. Henry Wirz was the only one who was from Andersonville with the Civil War. So it wasn't like they weren't going to do it. But again, read it, study it, see what you think. It is a very fascinating and ugly part of American history. But again, war is hell. And that's the whole point of it. War is a terrible thing. So what's up for us next, Mary?
Next up, we have, you did our episode thing. What are we talking about?
We're talking about the Sultana,
Oh, that's
Mary.
right, the Sultana.
It's like you don't even pay attention anymore.
I just drew a blank there. We were talking about the Sultana for the next episode, which happened on April 26th, 1865.
Sad part of history after the war again.
Yeah, same day John Wilkes Booth was captured or killed.
We're going to stay in the Debbie Downer field this month.
Yeah, April's not a happy month.
It certainly is not. But again, we're going to talk about the Sultana. We got some fun stuff going. So we have our YouTube live tomorrow morning at 9, which is going to be earlier than we think.
Yeah.
We'll be setting up a round table here pretty soon. We got a lot of fun stuff coming down the path, I mean.
Yep.
Any final words from you, Fincher, before we jump off?
Thanks for bringing it like you always do, and discussing a subject that is very, like I said, I think this is, Fort Pillow needs to be looked at more than ever because of what has happened there. And it is one of those battles where you have to sift through the evidence, and, it is one, you bring it up, be prepared because you're going to get strong emotions on either side. It
was. I think so. Enough of the pillow talk for us, Mary. Why don't we jump off here and get to the rest of the weekend? So again, everyone, thanks for listening. We appreciate the support. And any final words from you, Fincheru?
No, thanks to our listeners again for being with us for these 147 episodes. And thanks again to you. And we will see y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.